supplies splayed out on the floor. Got a few minutes yet, huh?
Mhm.
Lee was wearing a shirt from Sheboygan Redskins.
Hmm.
He's from Sheboygan.
Uh,
It's time they changed their name.
yeah.
And you may have already known this, that Tom is from Port Washington.
I didn't know where he's from. No.
Yeah, he grew up in Port Washington.
I was nervous this is going to work until somebody else comes on.
Oh,
It's plenty early, but so I had the recording turned off. It's now turned on for everybody's information. I'm gonna wait till 7:05 to start, and it's 7:05 now.
If you want to give it 2 minutes, I'll just go down and check my downstairs door to make sure my webinar sign is up.
Okay, all right. I'll talk.
Yeah, I'll be back in about 90 seconds.
Okay, why don't we start? I'd like to welcome everybody. The president of the UNA, not Mary, Linda Bauman, apologizes. She had to go to Milwaukee for something at the last minute. So she asked me to kind of MC this meeting tonight. So on behalf of her and all the UNA board, I'd like to welcome everybody to our first lecture series after our summer recess, which we always take during at least July and August, sometimes June, July, and August. And as with tonight, we plan to have engaging speakers on the second Tuesday of each month during the fall, winter, and spring months, except for November. And for the immediate future, our programs will be via Zoom because of the COVID. And if you're a member of UNA USA Dane, you'll receive an electronic notice about the meetings, or you can find information on our website at unadane.org. And if you're already a member of UNA Dane, you can be, if you're not a member, you can become a member at any time by going to that website, unadane.org, scroll down to the Join Our Chapter link, and just follow everything from there once you click on that. Also, we would appreciate donations to the work of our local UNA chapter. Currently, our work involves advocacy with legislators, federal legislators, co-sponsoring a youth conference on climate change, which is very exciting. And I won't go into any information tonight because I don't want to take time from our speaker, but you'll receive information about that conference via social media and on our website. I'm preparing a notice to go out on our website in the near future, so you'll know about it. And we'll sponsor our annual program celebrating the founding of the United Nations. And this year that program will be on November 14th. So put that in your calendar. It will again be by Zoom, and the theme will be United Women, United Nations, Shaping the Future of the World. So we have a lot of things going with the UNA Dane at the moment. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. If I can get, if I can get my scroll this a little bit. Our speaker, who's Jim Good. Jim grew up in New Orleans, attended Tulane University, where he received a degree in architecture. He also attended the Rhode Island School of Design for 1 year, and later, after graduation, moved to Madison. He worked for the University of Wisconsin before creating Interworks, LLC, in collaboration with other partners. Jim has over 20 years of experience in emergency planning, post-disaster reconstruction, emergency management training, disaster simulation design, disaster and program assessment, and workshop facilitation. Did you know that, Jim?
Yeah, that all sounds true so far.
Okay, good. Much of his work and the work of others at Interworks is for the United Nations. And prior to COVID, most of the training and consultation work was done on site throughout the world. Needless to say, they traveled a lot. However, since COVID, Interworks staff have had to rely upon online training. Jim will talk tonight about some of his work with the UN, providing training in preparation for disasters to protect people and infrastructure. This is particularly timely, I think. It's a particularly timely program because the United States is facing several disasters right now, resulting from fires, floods, and droughts. So preparation for disaster is equally as important as home as on the other side of the world. Lastly, in the interest of full disclosure, Jim and Laura are longtime good friends of our family, and Jim and my wife Susan were business partners for many years. So with that, I will turn the program over to Jim.
All right, thank you, Todd. I'll just say a few words before I launch here. It's nice to have a collegial group, and I recognize many of the faces I see too. I'm going to talk tonight about preparedness. And you know, the old saying is a pound of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And in the disaster management business, you virtually never get prevention, but you can get some level of preparedness, and you can get a level of mitigation. In other words, making things a little bit less when they do happen. But for my money, the best value for this kind of work genuinely is in presuming the bad things will happen and making people ready for them, simply making them aware and ready so that they can optimize what they have. I'll just add one little bit to Todd's introduction. By a fluke, I've been doing this work for about 30 years, all based here in Madison, but traveling internationally, as Todd said. Interworks was founded by me and my partner at the time, Paul Thompson, who has since retired, but both local Madison architects who kind of fell into a trap of getting involved in international humanitarian work. My entry point was in shelter reconstruction, storms, earthquakes, which led a little bit into refugee camp issues. And then through the University of Wisconsin Disaster Management Center, we got a very large contract with the UN Refugee Agency, literally to professionalize their emergency response. And that runs about 30 years ago. So I spent about 10 years traveling disaster hotspots, looking at emergencies, and organizing training and preparedness activities on the ground with the local affected people. And over time, the kind of focus this has shifted almost by decade. The first decade was very largely was shelter and how to rebuild things. The next decade went much more to refugee issues. And then that quickly became not shelter, but coordination, the real ask on international humanitarian response, which is what I focus on, is not really on the small details, but exactly on how all the multitude of actors who come, how they work efficiently together. Because that's where things go really wrong. So with that little bit of addition, I'm going to jump into this. And what I'm going to cover tonight are three very specific examples that I've worked on in the last few years, two before COVID and one after. The first is a monsoon contingency planning exercise that was done in Cox's Bazar for the Rohingya refugees who had crowded into the Kutapalong camp and all the associated camps to the tune of about 1 million people in a very, very short time frame in an extremely impoverished and vulnerable area. And the monsoon rains were coming after this camp was built. So the idea was, how do we prepare for that population? The second example is a refugee emergency preparedness simulation that was done in Tajikistan in 2018. The previous year, the UN refugee agency there and the government of Tajikistan really felt that there was going to be a major spring offensive of the Taliban, and that Tajikistan would receive Afghan refugees in very large numbers. And they wanted to do a full-scale field simulation to test that out and see what it would be like if it happened, and see what they could learn in getting ready. And the third example is a post-COVID example. The program ran earlier, but what I want to focus on is how it was adapted when we cannot go to the field, how the online training program works. So those are the three examples that I'll talk about. And this third one, the big arrow going across the globe, is because it is a global program that the UN Refugee Agency uses to train line staff in quiet offices how to be ready to deploy in 72 hours to emergency hotspots. So it's the way that they move staff to the field when new emergencies break out. I'm going to try to do this in about 35 or 40 minutes and have 20 minutes or so at the end for any questions or your own observations. If you do have a question just on clarification, or if something I'm saying just doesn't make sense, let us know, we'll answer it. But for bigger questions, observations, reactions, we'll try to take that all at the end, because there is some benefit in comparing the three as we talk about preparedness in general. So I'm going to jump to it. Bangladesh sits right there between India and Myanmar, or Burma. The background situation, it's a super high population and low wealth density country, means there are too many people and they're poor. There is a chronic political unrest. There are always murders, riots, real insecurity for every election cycle, along with a major famine on the order of every 10 to 20 years. Interestingly, there has also been a major refugee influx from Burma, now Myanmar, about every 20 years, going back at least 3 or 4 cycles, and probably much longer. The surprise for them, of course, was the nearly 1 million arriving in 2017. So it's an important point. The Rohingya going to Bangladesh, fleeing persecution, is nothing new. But what was new here was the scale of it was huge. And heavy monsoon rains literally every year, and the chance for a major cyclone and a periodicity of about once in every 10 years. So that's the background. We focused on Cox's Bazar. That is where the Kutapalong Refugee Camp complex sits. It's extremely low lying, it's flood prone, it's right in the mouth of the storms, and all of these problems come together there. I'm going to show here a little video, and I'm just going to make sure that the sound looks good. I'm going to play it. Just listen to it, what the people say. And this sets the backdrop for why we went to Bangladesh to do the exercise. It's a UNHCR spokesperson who will speak.
UNHCR is concerned that heavy monsoon rains and floods could bring about a new humanitarian crisis in the refugee settlements here. The sites are heavily congested and families have been building their houses where they've managed to find available land, but that includes on steep hillsides. And the problem is that these could be at high risk of being washed away in any landslide.
ভালো করে করেন যাতে খুব শক্ত হয় হ্যাঁ এবং যাতে কোনো দুর্ঘটনা না ঘটে ওগুলি আপনি শাহিদ কন্ট্রাক্টর
These are all mitigation measures being put in place in the camp prior to the monsoon coming. Sandbagging, making some stairs so it's not just a mud slide down these slopes and things like that. Just an aside, this land was completely forested when the first refugees arrived. All right, so that's a kind of a good picture of how it looks. The background of the population there, estimates were made at the time that about 300,000 people were living in high risk areas for mudslides and flooding in that terrain. I'm focusing on this little pie chart. There actually is a mistake in it. The numbers are reversed. It should be 4% elderly and 42% adult. But the important point here is 54% are children. And when you're thinking about preparedness activities, that does actually factor in. The other thing that this does show, the UN community, the NGOs working had done a pretty good job of mapping. They actually did know pretty much who was in the camp and had a good understanding of which areas would be most affected. The potentials and the pitfalls. So I was asked to conduct a tabletop simulation, meaning you get all of the partners together in a big hall, you simulate what would happen, and they meet and discuss what they would do, basically. In other words, there's no field component. And time was running out. I was asked to do this about 4 months before the monsoon should start. So the potentials were that we could actually achieve real practical preparedness for a humanitarian response to a very likely and imminent emergency situation. So the potential was high because people understood the risk and were motivated to do it. The other potential was that there were some real conflicts between the government of Bangladesh, between the different UN agencies, including on how to coordinate the response, the NGO community and the refugee community as well. So we hope that with this little exercise, we could demonstrate in a transparent way how people could work together and hopefully prepare a space where they could really do some quick practical work. And of course, the idea is to save life and reduce suffering. The pitfalls, as I saw it at the time, was that it's an old trap in doing these kind of exercises that only the most savvy players and the most Western-oriented NGOs and UN agencies come. And the 80% of the workforce that are on the ground are too busy. They don't come, and they may not even know it's happening. The second thing, the time frame was very, very short, and we really did want to try to get very wide engagement to make this a valuable work. So it was a bit over ambitious to put it together in a very short time frame. and especially from distance. So one of the arguments I made was that I would have to go there, spend time on the ground to design it. And the third risk was that the worst thing that can happen in these exercises is that you check a box, that all the agency says, yes, we've had a simulation, we are now prepared, but that's just a veneer, that they can say we're prepared, but without actually doing the heavy work of getting anything done. So the quick strategy, it was impossible to do what they asked from Madison. So I proposed to them that I would go to Cox's Bazar and work on a little training workshop for the NGOs working at the field level in Cox's Bazar, walk through the camp, talk to people involved, find out what their concerns were, and try to build something that was absolutely practical for them. And while doing that, put together the elements of the tabletop exercise. So it had two components. One, a practical training in the field, just odds and ends for preparedness. And that work was supposed to give me enough information to design the preparedness exercise for monsoons. Go do training. While doing that, do some assessment. And while doing that, design the tabletop simulation. And then really push for active inclusion of refugee leaders in the camp, which are often not included. Push really hard and try to make some inroads with the government of Bangladesh representatives who often leave this to the UN to do, to try to get real engagement. So that was the game plan. These are just a few pictures of the assessment mission, walking around the camp, and a few things we observed. Super dissolvable hills everywhere, very, very steep sites. What you're seeing right there is a latrine that's been demolished by an elephant, because at the time when this was jungle, this was on an historical elephant migration pathway. And no one told the elephants that they were going to cut down all the trees and put refugees here. So they continued to come through the camp, even though it's no longer a jungle. It did turn out too that that was one of the real concerns of the people, more so than monsoons, is what to do about the elephants. This little video is a man I met from BRAC. It's a huge NGO based in Bangladesh, more staff than the entire UN combined. And they are really the boots on the ground. So this man's accent may be a little hard for some of you to understand, but try to lean into it. Turn your volume up if you need to. He has quite an interesting story to tell. It's short.
See? Good. Can I ask your name, please?
Yes, my name is Mohammad Zulfikar Ali. My short name is Zulfikar.
Zulfikar.
Yes.
It's so nice to meet you here. And you're working with BRAC and helping today with shelter program, I see.
Yes.
Is there any particular projects or activities you're doing to prepare for the monsoon coming?
Actually, earlier we are working general methods for building the shelter.
Yes.
But considering the coming rainy season, we have take three type of measure. But for there is a risk for landslide.
Yes.
So for landslide, we are preparing bamboo palissading with sandbag. Yes, there is here.
Okay.
And also, there is a we think that there will be the and we think that in rainy season the muddy will be the slippery.
Yes.
So that we have a plan to prepare the narrow access for road construction and also pathway. And also, that there is another risk is for drainage facilities is not enough. So I think we should make some drainage for passing out the garbage and sewage water. And also, for creating the better access, we will consider the stair. And it will be prepared by bamboo and sandbag.
Good. Well, thank you very much, and we wish you luck in your project.
Yes, and thank you very much for you and also your team and your UNHCR, because we are working with the financial and technical support of UNHCR. If UNHCR extend their cooperation, we will do the work in future. So, very good manner.
We wish you success.
His his last comment there is extremely telling. As I mentioned, they are a huge organization. They're volunteer based. They do have a large professional staff as well. But as far as putting people into the camp to do actual work, this organization would be by far the most important one, much more so than the UN, any of the agencies or anyone else, because they are the ones, the real interface with the work and with the people involved. If you couldn't understand what he said, basically they're improving drainage, they're improving access and roads, because they're really concerned that this is going to be washed out when the heavy rains come. I'm not gonna focus on this. It gets a little bit technical, but the reason I'm showing it is just to give a little bit of the flavor of the kind of training we did for the people working in the camp. So these few slides are from the training that was done. And I'll just highlight a few points out of this. I don't want to go into all of it into detail. This is an interesting one though. There are some international standards about developing camps. One of them is actually the slope, which should not be more than 5% because of excess erosion. And it's simply extremely hard to carry a 20-liter water container up a hill if you're a 7-year-old, up a 30% grade. And it's dangerous. I mean, you can just literally see how close these are to falling down. There was precious little land, in any land in this site that met that standard. The UN shelter team that was out there went through and looked around and made not international standard, but Kutapalong standard, you can call it. And this is the gross way that they evaluated how dangerous different situations were. And if the slope was 100%, that means a 45-degree slope, and you could see many there. They were basically recommending relocation off of those sites before the monsoon. That did not happen in all but a very, very few locations. Those that were less than that, the diagram at the left, they did do a lot of engineering to try to hold it together. The map on the left, everything gray is what is presumed to flood in the monsoon. The drawing at the right is super typical of the way that they prepared sites to build. Again, that's just relating to them. A lot of these bridges across waterways, because once the monsoon comes, there would be no way to cross these. So a lot of bridges were built, and they did withstand the monsoon. So that was a smart bit on their part. A lot of little training for all the NGOs and the people building about some basic tips for building the shelters as safely as they could, set back from the edges, trying to see different slopes, ideas about how to ditch and reinforce with sandbags around the very lightweight structures. These details here are about how to tie bamboo poles down to the ground to resist strong winds that could come in with a storm to keep them from blowing away. And then this guide came out. The UN was pushing this. The idea is technically correct, but there simply was not enough land to make this workable. A lot of stair stepping, a lot of sandbagging, and a lot of slight raising of shelters out of the floodplain. So that was what was done before the monsoon for mitigation. What I'm going to show you right now is the little video that we made to kick off the tabletop simulation. We invited everyone and we said, okay, pretend it's 2 months from now. Here's the new newscast of today. And after this news event, they started working to respond as well as they could. So this is just a little example of what they experienced in the tabletop simulation exercise.
Breaking news. This is Lyndall Hatton Smythe, CWN World News, Saturday, May 26. Thank you for joining us. Dramatic news in today from Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where a 1 in 100-year monsoon rainfall has caused unprecedented flash flooding and landslides. The emergency influx of over 650,000 Rohingya refugees from nearby Myanmar has turned a hilly rural area of small farms and wild areas into the 4th largest city in Bangladesh. The rapid building of shelters cut into the terraces of these steep hillsides, along with the deforestation of nearby areas, has created the perfect storm of conditions for disaster in less than a year since refugees began arriving here in Kutapalong. Many houses here are located at the edge of steep terrace walls, painstakingly cut into the soft soil of these hills. Making matters worse, the trees and plant covering that previously helped to reinforce these hills have now all been removed for fuel. Nearby areas that were once covered with vegetation that slowed rain runoff are also gone. The result has been disastrous. Death from landslides, lost homes, roads have been cut off by the rushing water, and many left stranded and in dire need. For live reporting from the scene, let's go to John in Cox's Bazar.
The camp has received over 850 millimetres of rain this month and an unexpected 310 millimetres in the last 48 hours. The camp is flooded and the Rohingya are now isolated on what would be called an island. Large areas of landslides can also be seen from the main road. Local communities have indicated that this is the worst in living memory. However, there are also fears about the water being poisoned by the location of toilets and pits in the camps. Local schools are being used as emergency centres, but these were quickly overloaded with people leaving their homes. The BRSC have set up an emergency centre in Kutapalong village, but reports a lack of basic supplies such as plastic sheets, drinking water and purification tabs. When I spoke with the Rohingya refugees, they said that we don't know what to do, where to go, our home is underwater, and also our food and cooking utensils have been lost. We didn't know what to do. Some families were able to move, but many weren't. We could not carry our materials, they are underwater, they said. But several families in my neighbourhood in Camp 16 were also hit by a large landslide. Some people didn't get away quickly, and some are maybe trapped. Another said that we were not sure where to go. The water came down the road and then built up till it was coming into our shelter. It happened very fast. We and others around us clung to the hills throughout the night. So some grim stories are happening here. It is also not clear where the hardest hit areas are, and there were no UN or government officials at the time. I think there is coordination meeting here today. Back to you, Lyndall.
This is Lyndall Hatton-Smythe, CWN World News. Stay safe.
So that was just the fiction that we presented to kick off the exercise. It's uncanny how close it came to the reality 7 weeks later. Very quickly, the tabletop simulation results, pretty positive. We did get a huge buy-in. The government came, the main NGO managers came, and the refugee representatives also came, although it was quite difficult. They needed a pass to get out of the camp, and they put themselves a bit at risk to actually come to this exercise in town. Nonetheless, they came and they had extremely good input. So in short, the exercise happened. Different groups formed. They did really crack into some very tough issues and many things that were simply unknown on a shared basis were made clear, which did pave the way for some much better response when the monsoons came. They were fortunate in a way. They were milder than expected. And so it wasn't the disaster that everyone was looking forward and everyone was presuming would happen. This is the group. This is representing a group in another room that is representing the people trapped in the flood in the refugee camp. So some of the refugee leaders are sitting at that table, listing out what they want and what their responses are. As it played out, people got different information about how many were dead, how many were missing, what was going on. And then the game of it is to play it out and see how information flowed and to see who had wherewithal to do what, to propose what responses. It was a high visibility event. The local news came and covered it. Everybody knew it was happening. Many communication gaps were highlighted, and at least a few of them were actually addressed before the monsoon season. Government participated fully, and they really shared some administrative procedures that were not understood previously. For example, the issue of using drones to do damage assessment was absolutely not allowed by the government for many, many requests. But in this exercise, it was revealed the right way to ask for that. And it was asked for, and it was permission was given, and they were able to use drone assessment during the monsoon and after. The international coordination body all embraced the exercise. It wasn't seen as a UNHCR or an IOM or any particular agency event. It was seen as a shared event. So it really did build a nice system of working together. The next two I'm going to cover much more briefly, but it's just to show two different approaches. This one in Tajikistan, the only difference here was that they had a desire to do this refugee emergency crossing simulation, and they had buy-in from the government to do it in really in the field, put up tents, model exactly what would happen in the field. So this one was not a tabletop simulation, but a fully designed field simulation with about 160 refugee actors and many, many people playing. And I'll just show you a little video of how it worked. The quick backdrop: Tajikistan has chronic refugee influxes from Afghanistan. The ethnic Tajik Afghans tend to go to Tajikistan, as you would imagine. Again, chronic insecurity, especially in the Fergana Valley, super dense, full of enclaves and exclaves of the former Soviet republics, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Tajiks, Uzbeks, all living very, very close to one another, and kind of inter-ethnic clashes break out again about every 10 years in a major way. Very poor country, continuing poverty. And they don't have cyclones, but they do have very common earthquakes, floods, and landslides, especially in the spring. So in this case, we focused on a particular border crossing point called Nizhny Pianj and the threat of a spring offensive. And the idea was to model what that would look like, and again, test out how communications would work and who would be able to do what, how quickly. So the quick chart again, the potential was to really get preparedness. And again, in this case, a very likely and imminent emergency situation. Very opportune now, as we look at the situation in Afghanistan right now. We'll see if this had any effect. The real potential here was to build a sense of teamwork, because the military, who largely responds to disasters in Tajikistan, was not working closely with the UN up to this point. The pitfalls, again, failure to engage all the parties. We were really worried that the government of Tajikistan and the military, who actually run the emergency dispensaries, would not come, or that we wouldn't get permissions to do this in field locations. The Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because they are quite sensitive and very unusual to get them allow people to go to border areas and run these kind of events. Again, it was just overambitious, too much too soon. And in this case, the response was that we can't do it in the time frame they wanted. They literally wanted it in 3 weeks, from the ask. And this takes a lot of work to set up a field exercise. So rather than the field exercise, we went and did a workshop about how to do a field exercise. And as luck would have it, one of the military officers, very high, who was in that workshop, came to us after the workshop and said, you know, it doesn't matter how much you ask. If this isn't in our budget for next year, it won't happen. And so we said, well, when is your budget deadline? He says, next Thursday. So because of the workshop and because he was interested, the UN learned the one window to make the request. They've made the request, and the military, they took it. They funded their part. And once it's funded, it all ran. Everything was easy after that point. And again, it was a simple idea of being able to talk to somebody and literally ask an administrative question and get it solved. But it did take 2 years to do it. And again, the same problem, that very often these field exercises are really a show, and everyone wants to have the script and they want to show a perfect response without actually testing people. They don't like to have curveballs thrown at them. And in this case, as I said, we used the first little workshop to build interest in doing the field exercise. That gave us a foothold and a lot of good contacts. Over the year that passed, we put it together and we got it. We got a big area of land, 160 something actors who had previously been refugees who are settled in this area. And basically all of the major players came and the field exercise was run. I'm just going to show you a little PR spot that one of the NGOs put together. This, in a minute or two, will basically show you what happened.
And what is the situation of the refugees here?
Well, the situation that we see here behind us, we have a group of refugees that this morning have been basically crossing the border between Afghanistan into Tajikistan.
So all the responders are the actual responders, and all of the refugees are locally settled refugees who are playing the role of just coming across the border now. So the World Food Program came out, set up tents, did a food distribution, they did all of it.
Better.
Хотя это первый раз в истории Таджикистана и нашей организации проведение такого большого масштабного мероприятия.
I think it was excellent exercise. Everything united with government organization and emergency, community emergency.
رضا شدیم شرخندر دادیم باید همچه زیرو دادیم باید میگذاشتیم باید با چیگر بشیدیم چی کردن هم گذاشتیم دوجه دیر مخچور اومدیم اونا در
The really interesting part of that lady's story, if you heard her closely, she was a refugee from Tajikistan who ran to Afghanistan. She came back and now she was playing the role of an Afghan Tajik coming to Afghanistan, coming to Tajikistan. Really briefly, it was a real success. All of the important decision makers, including international donors, came together for the exercise. Part of the ask for the the line managers of the agencies was to quickly put together an emergency response budget and present it to donors. And they did it in the day and came up with an extremely realistic project, and the donors didn't blink. It's really, really interesting that, you know, the way that, just to show that things can be done quickly. This Polycom system that's highlighted in blue, the Tajik government had a system provided by the Russians to basically like have Zoom, but have Zoom, you know, 3 years ago in a working system, so that they could see and talk to people at the regional warehouse, down in the field, and at the emergency operating center in Dushanbe, and pretty good coordination throughout. So it was a good exercise. Again, really high visibility. Several logistical and administrative glitches were really practically illuminated, so that they could be understood and shared and worked on. And the best thing that came out of it, the exercise ran so well that they ran it again the following year on their own, without outside expertise, and they would have gone again until COVID shut them down. Yeah, and now, given the situation in Afghanistan, we'll see if there was any benefit there or not. And this link to COVID brings us to the last one, and I'm really just going to take 5 minutes. I see I've gone a bit long. But this last example is just an example of what we can do right now when we can't do those other kind of exercises. The UN Refugee Agency globally still faces chronic refugee influxes. Global warming is making everything worse. Political instability and rise of authoritarianism globally leads to much more insecurity. Forever evolving hotspots. It wasn't that long ago everyone thought Venezuela was going to erupt and swell over, swamping the Americas with refugees. Myanmar, Afghanistan, Ethiopia on the burner again, and on and on and on. The refugee potential for emergency is a house of cards, and now the house of cards is on fire. And you put COVID-19 on top of that, and this is the ask for how to update a preparedness program for their staff. I'm going to jump to it without going through these points, but basically, as usual, potential is to do things better. The pitfalls for training staff to go on an emergency roster is that you train them and they won't be released from their own country operations, because those who are nominated are sort of too valuable to send. The other possibility of if you really do a heavy simulation where you really show all the things that can go wrong, you can scare off good candidates from wanting to do international work. And if you go too soft, you kind of paint a rosy picture that's not helpful to them when they do get to the field. So there are real pitfalls on how to present this to international staff who would move to respond. And of course, COVID-19 slows down everything. And for a long time last year, nobody could deploy anyway. In a nutshell, the idea is, how do we convert field-based training, which we had been doing for them in the past, to an online set of training that would work? And basically what we did, we went through and looked at all of the material. This previously had been a 11-day field intensive course with field simulation. Everything that was policy or guidelines or checklists, we reduced it to online training, and we just sent it to them, read this, know it, and give them a test. Everything that needed some discussion about how do we coordinate, how do we work as a team, how do we deal with different dilemmas, we do now with an online simulation, a virtual simulation, where people get emails, they have dilemmas, they have to work as a team and solve problems. And then the standing plan is those last things that you can't trust to online that still have to be in the field, like first aid training, real psychological trauma response, when you need a counselor to literally talk to them and look at them and see how they're taking things. That's planned. That remaining part will be done in field training as soon as they can get across the COVID barriers to get back to it. So for the time being, knowledge-based stuff goes to online training. More nuanced things and teamwork, leadership, teamwork issues, they're done basically by Zoom meetings like this, with a lot of breakout rooms and tasking for the teams. Again, because of time, I'm not going to go into all this detail. The one thing I will point out is that we had space for 66, 288 applied. Super oversubscribed. People wanted to do it. It's a tricky way to sort out how you put these teams together, language profiles, gender, national representation, and then you have to try to work them out in ways that people are more or less in the same time zone. So we tried to put an Eastern group together so that when you're working across all these time zones, at least it's daylight outside for them, and then a Western group, and then only I then have to stay up overnight instead of all of them. Yeah, it seems to be working. It's about 500% oversubscribed by the agency, so that means people do like it. The first one is a little rocky. People didn't want to do online training. Within 1 year, that has completely changed. People are comfortable with it. If it's a good online training, they want to do it. And we do run some very engaging virtual simulations and other things. So I think we optimize what we can do given the COVID circumstances. I'm very sorry for going so long. I do want to stop there, and Todd, I'll go over to you. And from my side, I can take questions as long as you have. From your side, we'll see how that went down.
Well, Jim, thank you very much. Even though I've heard you talk about much of this in the bits and pieces from now, here and again, I learned a lot of stuff tonight and very impressed with the work you folks at Interworks do, but all the people across the world, just in recognizing the need to be prepared and pursuing that preparedness. So thank you so much. So are there any questions? Put your hand up, or however, speak up. Maybe put your hand up either virtually or
I have a question.
Yeah, questions, yes. Observations, contradictions, anything's welcome.
Oh, it was just fascinating. I've never known about all this stuff going on. Thanks, Jim. I had a question in the initial video about there was a man filling sandbags and helping so that things didn't slide down. Yeah. Would that person be paid to do it? Are people from the camps paid, or do they just do it, or what? How does that work?
Yeah, there's a whole regime for that. My immediate answer would be probably he was paid, not much.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And that very likely would have been some of the NGO staff, the BRAC that I mentioned, but there are 600 NGOs involved. And one of the interesting things is you find out that, church groups, mosque groups, the Red Cross societies, local do-gooders, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of organizations are working. Very often they're not included and don't include themselves into the bigger coordination events. So in this particular case, the game is how do you get the message, how do you kind of harmonize approaches, strategies, materials for all these different groups. But that guy was, the one that you saw there most likely was a low paid NGO volunteer. They do get paid. The other possibility, they do organize refugee work committees, and they often also either get a small payment or they may get an increased food ration share or some other encouragement. And beyond that, there are other committees who simply work on their own, but most likely that was a guy who got paid something to do that work, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Very rewarding work.
Yeah, it is interesting work.
Another question. While you're thinking of your question, I'll say something I forgot to say in the introduction. I missed it. Jim spent 2 years in the Peace Corps in the Philippines.
Yeah, that's true. That feels like a long time ago, but that's true.
Yeah,
I got my introduction to disaster management work there. I literally watched the roof blow off of the school next to our house in one of the big storms that came through, and we did a lot of reconstruction work there. We were attached to the local development administration, and as a young architect, I did a lot of reconstruction projects with bamboo and dirt. I see a hand behind you, Todd.
Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, Jim, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for what you've been doing your whole life, this work, and then also for doing this tonight. So I'm a little bit confused. I just need some clarification.
Sure.
When there are 600 NGOs involved, who's in charge? Who coordinates all of this?
It depends on the country. I mean, the most honest answer is that it depends on the country. If we go to Turkey, for example, the government is in it. They restrict who plays and who doesn't by granting of visas or not. And they play a very active role. In other countries where the government either isn't interested or doesn't have the budget or doesn't feel they have the expertise, it will go to the UN system. And the textbook answer is, if it's in a refugee emergency, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees will be the lead coordinator of the whole response in partnership with the government. If it's any other kind of emergency, storms, floods, internally displaced people who may in fact be in basically identical situation as a refugee, but who have not crossed an international border, it falls to a different coordinating structure called the Interagency Standing Committee, the IASC, and they have a huge model called the cluster system, where all the UN agencies have put up their hands and said, as a means of last resort, we will take this sector. So UNICEF has their piece, UNHCR has their, WFP takes food and logistics and communications. And agency by agency, they pre-agree that if no one else does it, as a last resort, we will do it. And that turns out to be largely a default. So these agencies each have their piece, and they work under these enormous bureaucratic exercises of putting together a joint emergency budget response. Because at the end of the day, the UN they do a lot, but it's not exactly the way you think they do a lot. They do a lot in mobilizing the money, administering the fund, monitoring, evaluating, and all that. But at the end of the day, the smaller NGOs are the ones who are doing the work, and UNHCR gives them the money, basically. UNHCR does have direct functions in the legal aspect and child welfare and some of those kind of things. But for the down and dirty thing of building shelters, handing out food, providing medicine, doing nutritional assessments, those are very, very often done by NGOs, but it's all under the great big budget, which put together by this joint consortium of the UN agencies. In one way, the refugee emergency is easier because it's one agency. It's the UN Refugee Agency. But for all the other natural disasters, it's a committee every time. But on the plus side, this system has been running 10 or 12 years, I think now. So it's pretty routinized. I mean, coordination is worlds better than when I started doing this work 30 years ago. I mean, from 30 years ago to 15 years ago, it was just cowboy country, figure something out. There really are now structures and systems in place, and that didn't used to be true. Sorry, and one other very correct answer to your question. Technically, and in some cases, really, the government has sovereignty. They can kick out whoever they want, issue a persona non grata in their visa, and you don't come back. If they want to get rid of an NGO that they don't like, they simply quit extending their visas, and as their visas expire and they go home, they don't let them come back. And that can, depending on the government, can be very beneficial to simplify and clarify things, or it can seem a little simply authoritarian and heavy to keep out troublemakers that they don't like.
Sue has a question.
Well, first an observation on your Bangladesh training. I was really surprised to see the terrain. I mean, I've always imagined Bangladesh as low-lying, and so just the hillsides and the steepness was quite surprising. What I'm wondering is, you're dealing with an emergency situation, but when you have an influx of refugees and those numbers that have pretty much demolished the jungle and the habitat that was there, what kind of additional tensions and pressures result from the local population?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a lot, right? I mean, it's a huge, it's just a huge burden for Bangladesh. I mean, just think about the local politics for us Americans, how irritated we get to receive some refugees in the southern border when we're plenty rich enough to deal with it. And now look at Bangladesh, who is desperately poor, super crowded. I mean, their primary valuable asset left is land. To make that chunk of land available for 1 million people is huge. It's a huge ask, and they do it. You know, so I give them a huge amount of credit. I mean, you could go around and look at a lot of governments where they're way, way more gracious and accepting refugees. To be quite fair, very often it does lead to real political tensions and problems for them later. You know, Angela Merkel got in trouble for a rather liberal, relatively liberal refugee policy, paid a political price. The Turks famously admitted hundreds and hundreds and thousands of Syrians and actually put up and ran first-class, high-quality refugee camps with high levels of service. After about 4 years, I have to quick math, no, a little bit longer, 6 or 7 years, the political situation got so high that they shut them down. Local people were mad. Rumors went around in Turkey that the Turkish governments were giving grants of $1 million to every Syrian family. You know, the kind of fake news cycle, but it does generate real tensions, and it causes real political problems for the governments who have a liberal approach. It absolutely does, yeah. Did that answer your question, Sue, or did I kind of talk around it?
You talked about the field simulation in Tajikistan for the refugees. How does it, now that Afghans actually, after the fall of Afghanistan, and so how, and we know that the some Afghans have actually crossed the border to Tajikistan. How does the simulation compare to the actual what's happening on the ground right now?
I'm sorry, I don't have the answer. I have not been in touch with them yet, and I don't think the real test has come yet either. The kind of relationship with Tajikistan and the ethnic Tajik Afghans, in many ways, it's the same or similar to Pakistan and the Pashtun Afghans, who kind of go back and forth easily enough. So in one way, it's not a big thing. The problem will be if there is a really big influx, which has not happened yet in Tajikistan. So in other words, as far as I know, the big push that would trigger setting up a camp, putting extraordinary means on the border to deal with the huge influx has not happened. I really don't know. I don't have my finger on the pulse. I don't know if the number of crossings into Tajikistan from the ethnic Tajik Afghans is on the increase right now or not. I have to believe it is, but I really don't know. But as far as the real test, we don't know yet because no huge influx has come as of yet.
Any other questions? Louise.
So Jim, are you currently involved in any of the Afghanistani refugees?
We are being asked to do some again, our hands are tied because of COVID. Can't really go anywhere. The UNHCR is asking us to do some training for two specific contingencies right now. One is the so-called Afghan situation, and that training is for the countries who would receive refugees from Afghanistan. But they are also trying to involve the organs and agencies inside Afghanistan who work for displaced Afghans, because that's also a huge issue. The violence in Afghanistan displaces a lot of people around the country. So there are programs for them as well. It's unclear yet how that will all work under the Taliban rule. They traditionally, they have worked with international aid providers as long as they're providing aid. But as of right now, everything is up in the air. It's to be seen. But the simple answer is yes, we are asked to do a training for national staff who are bracing for a big emergency move. The other one is for Myanmar right now because of the ongoing instability in that country. They're really concerned about internal displacement, really, and I guess possibly also refugees again going to the Thai border up near Mae Sot. So yeah, we're being asked right now, but at the moment they are kind of planning landmarks in the future. I'm not actively working on anything for them right now.
Other questions? If not, Jim, thank you very much. We appreciate you taking an evening to talk with us and give us some really good, hard, down-to-earth information about things that are happening in the emergency preparedness around the world. Very
yeah. I guess if we're wrapping up, I mean, the only thing I'd leave everybody with, it's sort of a long shot, that any of these things work. And there's scant proof. In my own opinion, it's almost impossible to evaluate how much things worked because it's very hard to show causality. In other words, let's say the refugees come and they have a fantastic response. It may or may not be because of the training that we did. So we always have a bit of a leap of faith in these things that it seems to make sense. I think it makes sense. And it has to be better than doing nothing. Mm-hmm. But the feeling of satisfaction of being able to prove you made a difference is extremely elusive.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think everybody here appreciates the fact that what you do, you try to make a difference, and probably does make a difference, even if you can't measure it. So thank you.
Yeah,
and as Judy put up hands,
so interesting.
That we'll all clap.
All right, thanks everybody.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
All right,
everybody.
thanks Todd. Thanks for the gig. Talk to you guys later.
Yep. Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.